With strong export markets established and the rising value of the catch, fishers invested in new boats, better technology, and fishing gear made of modern materials. They also began to expand their fishing to new areas and to greater depths.
Just before I left town to go down to Cape Cootie, I did fish this bank up by Cape Border, and I've been told to relate the story that no one had fished it before, and it was about 4 mile off the shore, just at one edge. It was about 3 mile long, and I think the first set we got 740 odd crayfish off it, which was, I've never batted again after that. So I sort of fished most of the rest of my career around Cape Cootie and on the south coast without coming back to Cape Border again. Well, I bought the boat in 1970. 1970, yeah, that's right. And then I decided to buy a fiberglass boat from Western Australia with 48 footer. And I worked that for 7 years down in that same area. And I reckon after that, my son didn't really want to take over, so I sold it and sort of retired, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, finding new bottom was fantastic because you knew the further you went out to find bottom and you did come across bottom, you probably had a fair idea that only 1 or 2 people might have fished it. A good thing back then when you did find bottom, the year after you probably couldn't find again because you didn't have GPSs and you had to wait for a good radar day to get good say from mainland, which sometimes you're 40 miles away from land, so that radar used to have to be pretty good, and you'd have to get 2 marks, one on one part of the land and the other one, so you could get in the middle of it. So, but some of the pots that we had seen back then when we first found bottom were just crazy. I remember one day I pulled a pot. I set a pot and I went back and found these other little 2 lumps the day before, and I put 3 pots in that, and those 3 pots didn't fish. So I said, I will go and pull this other pot, and it was down for about half an hour, and we pulled it and had 37 crows in it, and crows were all over the neck, and they were just falling off, and that was probably, for half an hour, it was unreal to see a pot come up so full. No, that definitely, spot like that has never been fished before, but I don't think, I tried to fish it again, but I never got a 37 off it again. I got some good pots, but not a 37. I would call myself, and I would call fishermen back then, like the hunters. We were, you'd always strive for that extra little bit. And, you know, yeah, it was fantastic finding bottom. It was a challenge the next day to find your pots, because no GPSs back in those days. So we used to work, I think, 60 pots and 27 flags. So, and the sunlock. So we'd go northeast, and if you're making yourself a coffee or something, if you went off course, the next day you'd have the binoculars out looking for your pots. And so it was hard. And there was bad days too though. You'd find bottom and you'd think you couldn't sleep that night because you were so excited the next morning, and you'd pull the 25 for nothing.
Came here in the railways. This is actually a photo of the last train leaving the old Kingston railway station before the new one was open, and that's me, the second one in there with the blonde curly hair, which is no longer there. Well, I went fishing for the season, and I found it very exhilarating and enjoyable. I bought a fishing boat. The boat and licence weren't very dear at the time, and I saved up enough money to buy a boat off a person here that wanted to get out of it. And a bloke by the name of Ron Chandler took me for 3 months and showed me where not to go and how to fish, and he only wanted to stop 3 months. So after that I found another deckhand, and that I've carried on since then. The prices, it was quite humorous really. The first year I started, I was talking to the chap I bought the boat off, and he asked me what the price that day was, and I said that was the first time they went to 10 shillings a pound. And his comment was, God, if I'd known that, I would have never sold it.
Met Anne, my wife, and got married in 1983. And I took her on board as a deckhand. And that was the year we went out to the continental shelf, because we always believed there was lobsters out there. In fact, Jürgen Andressen, he had a boat called the Aussie Check. And he told us, he used to put his shark nets right down in 100 fathoms, and he told us he got crayfish down there. So that was the main reason we went out there. So we went out there and dropped some pots, and they came up, full. You know, there was 10, 15, 20, sometimes more lobsters in them. And so that became a new thing, and we fished it for quite a while, and then everyone eventually found out. So that produced a lot of lobster. We are much more fortunate nowadays. We have much better equipment, much better boats. We don't have to worry about a wooden boat falling apart and sinking like we used to. That was on our mind all the time, but that was something that we were brought up with, and we knew how to look after wooden boats. And I love wooden boats. There's nothing better to have a beautiful wooden boat. There's something about them. They're quiet, they're warm. Going to new places was a good thing when you were in the 80s. First time I ever came to Kangaroo Island. And I met my uncle, Kangaroo Island, Lionel Puckridge. He had a beautiful big boat in those days, a 50-foot boat called the Westward. And I remember meeting him when I was a little kid, and then I met him in Weir's Cove, and that was good. Then we started fishing the West Coast. I'd never been into Ceduna or Fowler's Bay before. It's good going into, it was almost like being an explorer. That was a good part of the fishing industry.
Most of the fishing, the boats had their own areas. Some boats would work out of Hall's Bay, then you had another group in boarding house, and then you had a few more on the void. But my fishing, I used to like just wandering around, trying different areas, new areas, and I could pop up anywhere in that boat. Then progressed to bigger boats. It was just travelling all the time, trying new areas. After this little cutter, I built a wooden boat in Melbourne. Had that for a few years, and then I progressed to a steel boat, big steel boat, because I was involved in shark fishery too. And the management of the fisheries, you got forced into going bigger and bigger. Even if you was happy with a small boat, you couldn't compete unless you borrowed money and went into bigger boats. And then we found ourselves in 18% and 21% interest rates, and sort of took the shine off. Was always in debt, owing money. It was a good living, but it wasn't until the live export of crayfish that we really made some money. Before that, it was just struggling to make your boat payments and pay your crew and send your kids to school, build a house and spend your money in the community. Is why, as they were owner-operators, everyone had a family, the crews had families, and the money went back into the community.
I started in 89, I think. I can't quite remember, it was my first year, but it's right at the cusp of when GPSs all became more functional and available, and instead of just being able to get fixes in 3 or 4 times a day, they became a permanent positioning system. When it was happening, I was working on the deck for my father. My brother had his own boat, and he said that he wanted to get a GPS plotter. And my father said, "What do you need one of those for? What's wrong with a flag?" And that certainly was a real game changer, was the GPSs. The way that they expanded our fishery, which we thought was an endless resource, just keep finding more bottom. We thought we could spread our effort more and take pressure off other bottom, but it more or less just meant we became so efficient that nothing got a rest, nothing got missed. And then with the advent of electronics later on with sonars, a few other boats were in front of me, but I'd only been driving the boat for a couple of years, and I paid and put a sonar on the boat myself because my father still owned it. And then later years I've kept up with the technology. I put a WASP system on, which is a real incredible bit of machinery that as you get older, your memory fades, your WASP can totally takes over from that.
I started out as a young kid walking to school, walking down to the main wharfs of Port Lincoln, looking at the fishing vessels, the cray fishing vessels, the prawn boats, the tuna boats. And I always thought I want to get involved in this. So that's basically how I started in this fishery. I worked on a couple of conventional hull boats in the 80s and that, sharking and craying. And then eventually I got involved in the fishery with a partner, and then gradually brought that partner out over time and been owner operator since 1986 and still doing it today. Love the fishery, love the hunting and gathering of it.
The boys, all the kids, they've got it so easy now with these plastic and tin boats and getting along at 16, 17 knots, where we done the hard yards at 3 o'clock. You'd go 2:30, 3 o'clock and get home at 3 or 4 o'clock, and only on a compass. And the boys, the GPS has come in and it turned amateurs into professionals. Oh, we come home 6 or 7 times while I had it, and had to come straight up on the slip because we've sprung them and all that, where the boys come home now, they go to the moorings and with the nice new boats, and they're pretty lucky nowadays.
Well, when I first started, I went fishing with on the boat the Nelly and with Donald Feast, and that was November 71, and yes, we fished a lot of rough days. And my first boat in 1975, I bought the licence, and it was 12 foot long. I bought it with just oars, and I finished up putting a 25 horsepower motor on that boat. And of course, being a Bonwood boat and me being a bit of a rev head, it didn't last very long. I finished up building a 14 foot Hartley designed dinghy. And then I put a 40 horsepower on that, and no sounder, pulled all my pots by hand, and yes, it wasn't easy. Well, in those days, yes, it was all tail market into America, and it was we didn't get a lot of money for our fish those days. It was only about $1.05 a kilo. It was tough times those days. When I first got into my licence, is that I had to sell my car and to get into the game.
Come over across to South Australia in '68, done a season here. Then I went back and done a couple of seasons in Port Fairy again. Then I eventually come back to South Australia, back to Carpenter's Rocks, and fished with the Stanky family for about 5 years. Then went on my own. That was an education fishing with the Stanks, because everything had to be done by hand. It was all hard work, like rowing out in the storms, running out pick lines and looking after boats and getting them off the beach when they're on the beach, and and then just, building gear, pots, thousands of pots. They had all the mechanisation, like good rigs and jigs to cut the steel and bend the steel and weld it and cover them and then paint the boat. So it was a lot of hard work there. They worked pretty hard there. They had a beautiful setup in their factory with their tailing and processing into America. I think we estimated there one day, we sat down and counted, when I was there back in the early 70s, there would have been 75 people actually working in that town. That's people from the fishermen to the truck driver and to the girls, women in the factory picking crays, and so it was a pretty busy operation. There was 3 or 4 other boats. There was old Bill Noonan was an old bloke there when I was there. Bill Noonan, Barry Manser, Cole Johnson. Some would go and some would come back. Stewie McEachran, Ian McEachran. And there was people way back before them too, like old Eric Manser, Bob Lee, the ab diver, and I used to do a bit of relief diving and shelling for him. And that gave me an idea of how going back into the reefs. So then I started fishing back into the reefs, and then I started working things out there where I used to shorten all my lines off and put special bobbers so to keep the line out of the reef. There used to always be a race to get into the shallow water on the first day.
We've always lived here in Point Turton, and we've sort of been in fishing, and the grandpa built numerous amount of boats, a couple of boats, and one in particular to go crane, which was the Bimbo. Dad branched out on his own in the early 70s, and had an opportunity from a local guy that he was very friendly with, and had the opportunity to drive the boat, and eventually had the opportunity to buy the licence and the boat, and went from there. And in 1980, he upgraded the boat to a bigger boat, and we've still got it now. Dad concentrated mainly around the Corny Point area, and down to Pondalowie, over to Wedge Island, and then when he bought the Rebecca, we started fishing more down the island a lot more because the catch rate was better, and obviously back then there was no quotas and things, so
The more you caught, the more you made. So, so spent a lot of time down there and in those later years. And now we sort of, since quota and since I've been driving the boat, we sort of concentrate more on locally, like just out of Pondy and up towards Corney, Wedge. We probably are the only timber vessel left in our zone anyway, so which is good in some ways. Sometimes it becomes a headache when it gets full of water.
I like the fishing and I was pretty keen on it. So I went from one boat to another boat, and I went on one really, really good boat, but you wasn't much of a bloke to work for, but you made a lot of money. And then after 3 years, I got off that boat. Now this is a true story, but just towards the end of the season, he said, "Now, Stump, if another job comes up, you better put in for it." And I didn't know what I was going to do, and we're sitting in the Somerset Hotel one day, on drinking time, and one of them, just the same group of blokes, and one of my mates said, "Well, what are you going to do? Why don't you buy your own boat?" And I said, "What with? I got no bloody money." I went down to Beachport and talked to this bloke, and he said, I'll give you such and such. And I thought, well, perhaps there is an odd one more around. And then the mate that started me, he rang me up. And he said, "Charlie wants to see your stuff." So I went and seen this Charlie bloke, and he said, "Tell me you interested in buying fishing boat stuff." I said, "I don't know, Charlie, but I've got to do something." He said, "How much you need?" I said, "I don't know." Anyhow, he got me kick-started. And ever since then, I've tried to do the same, look after. First year that I started was a very, very hard year. Very hard. But then, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I suppose, things started to pick up pretty well. And they've been pretty good ever since. You know, we've had hard years, but you get that in every industry.
Well, I started going out with Dad when I was very young. Once he got his own boat, the Irene, and really things didn't change a heck of a lot until when I started. I mean, my first boat was a 32-foot cutter with a 100 horsepower Ford in it, did about 7 knots, leaked like a sieve. Black and white sounder, but not an old ELAC, it was a Fruno by then, but very little difference. And in subsequent years, radar started to come in, colour sounders, probably 5 years later. The technology made poor fishermen good fishermen and put that much pressure on the fish stocks that then the fishermen collectively had to look at what they were going to do. Some of it was brought on by scientists. Science was just beginning in the fishery. There was studies done. Rob Lewis did some early tagging studies, and in later years we had other scientists come along, Jim Prescott amongst others, and the work still goes on today. And stock monitoring has seen us grow the fishery to the stage where we're harvesting a very stable stock, and I think that's extremely good for the modern generation of fishermen.
Fishing in the northern zone, when I first went up there I didn't know any bottom, so it was just a matter of basically running around, keep looking. But you worked out after a little while that the bottom runs, which way, northwest, southeast, roughly. So you've got chains of bottom that run, and it's a lot of granite up there as well, and that granite runs in the same direction. So you've got sandy outcrops, of bottom running similar to that. So finding new bottom is great. It's good, especially when it fishes well, because it seems like inexhaustible. I must admit, I never found anything big. There was a couple of, while I was up there was a couple of guys found pieces of bottom that had never been fished before, and a massive amount of fish come off them in one lift. Basically just fill your boat up in one lift and go home. It's the type of bottom over there is totally different to the southern zone, whereas it's got a capacity to come back. There's actually more bottom down here too, whereas over there it was just sections of bottom here and there, and it was quick. There was only, when I was there was only actually 2 people, or maybe 3 people fishing 250 mile of bottom, and only 2 of us were actually fishing that 160 mile of bottom. A lot of bottom, but there's only 2 of us, but that's all it really handled. It was a good fishery, but it was one of those things, like I said, we all got the latest equipment. We had everything. We had holding capacity. There was nothing most people didn't know. What your GPSs were just, the invention of GPSs was just, did amazing stuff. You could just go there, but then everybody had it. That was it. There was nothing sacred anymore. Yeah, you might have had a little bit of a few pieces here and there, but nothing was sacred. And that's certainly what it's like in the southeast. There's nothing sacred here. Not that I know of anyway.
Got my own boat in 1980 with a bit of help from Ray McKinnon, which was an uncle of mine. He backed me. He wanted my brother and me to go in, and Phil had a good job on a boat, and I had a job on a boat too, but with my brother. But I wanted to have a go on my own, and I went and seen him, and he'd back me on my own, and he did. We went looking, and we ended up with a 28-foot azalea from Southend, come with all the gear, dinghy and all that, for $28,000. It was too dear. We went looking for a cheaper one, but that was the only one we ended up with. I had $3,000 and needed $25 from the bank, and struggled to get it, but we got it, and it's been good from there.
Fisheries have often had a bad rap for sustainability. Unfortunately, many media sources have reported more about overfishing or collapsed or collapsing stocks, or the need for comprehensive changes in the way fisheries are managed, such as massive marine protected areas. Some of this narrative holds true, but by no means does it universally describe all fisheries and their individual trajectories, nor the current management status. Take Australia's lobster fisheries, for example. No stocks have collapsed, although they have fluctuated in abundance, which has been at least partially driven by natural variation in recruitment. At times when stocks were in decline, action was taken to stabilize them. Management has been adaptive, and when changes were needed, they were made, albeit through what were often socially and economically difficult and contentious processes, something we'll return to. To help contextualize the management of Australia's lobster fisheries, it's useful to consider fisheries in terms of other primary industries and within environmental management more broadly. Agriculture has greatly influenced the terrestrial environment here and abroad. Even aquaculture is changing environmental change. But sticking to the land, our food and fiber production systems have fundamentally changed many terrestrial ecosystems, going back as far as when the first inhabitants of Australia introduced fire, what we often refer to as cultural burning today. Collectively, this has meant that some forested areas became natural grasslands, or was later planted to introduce grass pastures or to crops. But who hasn't stopped along a rural roadside to admire a crop of wheat, barley, or oats planted in perfect rows and sensed the importance of these crops? And a canola crop in flower is a sight many people stop to admire. Plantations of exotic trees, mostly pines native to California, cover large expanses of the state's southeast and provide essential building materials and now form a recognizable part of our landscape. Productive pastures of grasses and legumes feed millions of sheep and cattle, to name just 2 products that we either consume domestically or export. Our primary industries produce jobs, income, foreign revenue, and most importantly, the food and fiber that feeds and still clothes us. In most cases, our agricultural systems of production also rely on the use of insecticides, herbicides, fertilizers, fresh water, antibiotics, and fossil fuels, all of which have an impact on the environment in one way or another. Out of these inputs, the lobster fishery uses generally only fuel. And lobster fisheries, in contrast, have very little direct impact on the benthic or bottom habitats where fishing occurs. Footage recorded by Gary Kerr off the west coast of Tasmania shows a pot landing on the bottom. It attracts fish and lobsters, many of which come and go at will, but it does not have any perceptible impact on the seabed itself. It is worth pausing for a moment to watch what goes on around this pot, as it also provides wider insights into lobster behavior that clearly have implications for our understanding of how catch rates might be a product of much more than just how many lobsters were in the vicinity of a pot. Although pot fishing is relatively selective for lobsters, there is a small bycatch of other fish and invertebrates, and there are some interactions with larger fauna such as seals and sea lions, and even whales, but these can be mitigated by employing modified fishing gear and fishing strategies. The lobster fisheries in Australia have been very proactive in reducing plastics and other waste entering the marine environment. Perhaps one of the fisheries' biggest challenges is to reduce CO2 emissions produced in the process of capturing, holding, and exporting lobsters that in total are about 25 kilos per kilogram of lobster exported live to a market in Asia. However, in this regard, the fishery is by no means alone, as you can see in this graphic illustration that shows CO2 emissions at the point of retail market in Australia for other animal proteins. The sustainability of our lobster stock is no accident. Over the history of our fishery, many management interventions were made. In hindsight, most, if not all, of these were positive moves that have helped the stocks and helped the fishers and ultimately the broader community. But at the time of each intervention, not everyone could see the need for change, and there were changes that were often perceived to threaten livelihoods and the local economy. And there is no doubt that some of the interventions did have negative impacts on livelihoods. Management interventions in the 1980s began to reduce the fishing capacity of the fleet in both zones. In 1984, the number of pots held by each license holder in the southern zone were reduced by 15%. Followed in 1986 by a 10% pot reduction in the northern zone. Let's hear from people who went through these changes and how the measures affected them.
When I first started, we went through these processes of, like I say, the 15%, and then and that was confronting because some people had bought pots in that year and they lost 15% of those pots. So there was a bit of an uprise with that, and people started the season, thought they were going to have 60 pots in the water and already bought them, 10 pots or something, and they lost 15% of that.
I know the first year we bought the licence, pot reduction come in, and before we even got to fish it, we'd lost 5.
Pot reductions were soon followed by other major management interventions, and science played a growing role in informing the kinds of interventions that were made.
It have been mainly done through scientific studies, and we've had tagging programs and things like that. It must have helped the research. There's lots of programs they've had every year. They've had programs of some sort, and I know that it's been a help to the fishery.
In this fishery, we've seen a lot of changes since I've been involved. We've had pot reductions, we've had size limits, introduction of sill spikes and escape gaps. But probably the biggest one was when we went to quota in 2003. We thought our fishery was travelling very well in the 90s. I remember saying to some old fisherman back at the time, "Can this fishery keep going like it's going?" And his answer was, "Yeah." And I thought, okay, he probably knows more than I do. But eventually we started to tip over, and that's when we went to quota.
And then quota come along, and we'd just invested a lot of money, and we were going to go from pretty good catches down to probably not enough to pay our bills.
While the catches may be sustainably managed, the fishery will certainly meet many other challenges in the future.
The biggest threat I see is more the environment with the acidification of the oceans. It's not quite so much the pressure what the fishermen are putting into it, because we've been very controlled and conservative over the last 20 years. The other things that worry me is with the climate change, the currents of the ocean seem to be changing with, we've had settlement of East Coast lobsters up the west coast of their peninsula, which is the Great Australian Bight, in the last 3 years. And that's never been seen before. It wasn't in my father's time and other fishermen's time. So why has that happened? Things are changing.
Gregory Ward sums it up.
If you don't look after stock, well, it's pretty bloody obvious, isn't it?
To this point, we've talked about the biology, history, and management of the lobster fishery, but there's another very important aspect of the fishery, and that is the social and community aspect. After all, a lobster fishery is a human activity that interacts with lobsters. Our fishery has been very community-oriented, partly because it's situated in the small coastal communities from Port MacDonnell in the southeast to Streaky Bay and beyond in the west. While the commerciality of the fishery is what's driven it, fishermen have generally had a special relationship with the sea, with the lobsters, and with each other. In nearly every part of the fishery, if someone was in trouble, another fisherman was likely to be first there to help. If you needed help to haul your boat, other fishermen were the ones most likely to be at your side. If you needed financial help, another fisherman often helped to give you a leg up. Lobster fishing is very obviously an important feature of many of the South Australian coastal communities and economies.
Small towns along this coast are extremely valuable, and while tourism is part of part of their value, a lot of their value comes out of the fishing industry, and the pot prices drop, then investors will come in. I mean, it's already happened in Tasmania. In the newspapers in the last couple of days, there's a guy that now owns a significant amount of the quota there, and so unfortunately for those little communities, the skippers are only working for somebody else, and the wealth's going probably overseas. I don't know where. An example of what we're talking about, if an investor was to step in and if prices were to stay where they are now, if you look at a 60 pot holding at $30 a kilo, you're talking $180,000. That's barely enough to put fuel and bait on the boat, let alone pay a deckhand and a skipper and a $25,000 licence fee and insurance.
Yeah, lobsters on this coast are very important to my business. Not only do I have the commercial sector, but the vast majority of my domestic customers also are involved with amateur crayfishing, and most of them have lobster pots and are active fishers for lobster. So lobsters in this area, not only is it a big industry, it is also very, very big to the recreation centre. The recreationals are very dedicated to their lobster fishing, and they are out there with the commercial guys every morning, and they really live for that, and really a lot of them have no other hobbies other than just their recreational lobster fishing. Yeah, the commercial fishermen, certainly they look at prices when they're purchasing something. You have to be competitive, but also loyalty is very, very important with them. You particularly need to service their needs as they require, and over the years I have several very, very, very loyal customers amongst the commercial sector who in some cases have probably purchased 300 or 400 outboards off me. So yeah, I find with commercial guys that they are quite loyal, provided you service the product services them well. they look after their dealer. So yeah, maybe some of these people will have to sell their licences or move away from fishing. This would be a very, very sad thing, because for all of these people who have boats, particularly commercial boats, and are earning a good living, somewhere along the line their wealth goes back into the community. And if we have a reduction of boats and fishers, fine, the same amount of fish will be caught, but I see the distribution of wealth back into the local community as diminishing. And the wealth that comes from our local fishing industry is quite huge for this area, and it is very, very important for Mount Gambier.
Taylor Marine being situated here in Mount Gambier at the moment, it's very important, the lobster industry. It's more than sort of probably 80% of our business. If we didn't have the cray industry here, we just wouldn't have the store here, definitely. It's helped Taylor's in more the way of the guys are consistently out there. We haven't got the actual investors coming into the industry down here, where in Victoria, they've got industries, the cray industry, there's more investors than anything else, and people are leasing, where over here, the market's so big, the industry's so big that they don't have the investors. It's too big for the investors to take over. So it is a lot better for us here, because we're dealing with the guys that are actually own the licence and everything else like that, not just the guy that's paying the bills and buying a bit of rope for himself and that. He owns the licence, he owns the boat. Taylors have gone from a little store down in the middle part of town and that sort of stuff, and they went from selling motorbikes early on and way back in the days and that, and now they're selling their cray industries. We're one of the prominent businesses in the cray industry in Australia. That's one big part. We're just growing and growing and growing. Yeah, well, see, everyone loves their toys and that sort of stuff. That's the beauty. It's just a human thing. Everyone loves their toys. So you'll see fishermen coming in here. The vehicles they're coming in these days are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they don't need a big Dodge Ram to go fishing, but they love doing that sort of stuff. And especially, you either see a Toyota Land Cruiser, Ford Ranger, or a Dodge Ram these days coming into the shop and that sort of stuff. So they love spending their money on their toys and that sort of stuff. And every fisherman, professional fisherman's got an amateur boat as well. So they don't just spend it in the professional side with pots and ropes and all that sort of stuff. They send it all around the town and that sort of stuff. And it does help the whole town when they're catching well. You can see the whole place is just sort of picks up a bit and that. And as I say to people, if you really want to know how bad of a year a cray fisherman's had here in Mount Gambier, you can nearly go to the Toyota dealership every year and ask them how many they've sold, and then if they'll give you some figures up and down.
Had my shop here in Port Lincoln. At the peak of the time, I had 8 people working in the shop, 2 technicians, storemen. We did life raft servicing. It was quite a successful shop. But as the cray industry started to wind down, I went from excess of 60 boats to, in this particular area of Port Lincoln and Coffin Bay, I've only got about 16 now to service. So I've actually gone from an 8-man shop to a 1-man shop. So that's the effect that it's had on my business here. We used to run, there was 4 cars. That's 4 cars that are not here anymore. 8 people, of course, 8 families that are not spending in the community. So it's a lot. The crays, they were exploring new ground, so they were losing a lot of gear, and basically they were also spending money on technology, because I used to sell marine electronics, so they weren't afraid to experiment with new technology. So yeah, the craze was probably in its heyday a good 60% of the shop income. Yes, in the heyday we would have trade nights, and it was like the stock exchange. Everybody yelling out, for sales over here, sales. We would bring in salesmen from head office. We would have excess of $300,000 nights just in electronics, but that's all gone. We don't even have a trade night these days. So On my side of the cray industry, the effect of the cray industry, I would like to see it stabilise so it would actually give some future in this sort of business. Yeah, I'm getting towards the end of my working career. I'd like to see a future for some young people, like a husband and wife team could come in and have their own business that could support the cray industry. Because if there's not a money in it for them, nobody's going to do it. There's nobody here to support the gear and bring the money into the town.
But that's not the whole story. Many community members have vivid memories of lobsters in one form or another, stretching back to their childhoods, as we're about to hear.
When I was a child, we used to come to Port MacDonnell for mostly our Christmas holidays, I think. My dad and Mum had a house here at Port MacDonnell, and all along the waterfront there were a lot of older homes, hardly any of the new homes that you see there now, and the whole foreshore looked quite different to what it does now. Used to sometimes have fresh crayfish when my dad would walk out on the reef right out to the end of it, and he had a special spot that he used to go to, and he could just step off the reef and reach underneath and he could get a crayfish under there. So sometimes we had crayfish, but one thing we always knew we were going to have was the spiders that we got from down at the crayfish factory, which was down near the entry to the main road that comes into Port MacDonnell. And we would take our kerosene bucket down there, and the ladies, I think they were mostly ladies who used to work in there, would be working on a sort of a conveyor belt, and then the whole body with the legs would come off this conveyor belt, and we would put our bucket underneath the conveyor belt, and when it was full, we would go home with this big feed of crayfish bodies, which my dad would then cook up on the wood stove. And in the afternoon, then we'd sit down at the big table, and we'd have crayfish legs with vinegar and bread and butter, and we'd have the newspaper all spread out on the table, and we would sit there and have this feast day after day after day. After we had filled our buckets up, the rest of the cray bodies that were there, they were loaded into the back of sort of like a tip truck, I think, and they used to take it up to an area the other side of the lighthouse there, and there was a big chute up there, and the tip truck would tip all the remainder of the bodies just over the side. Nobody had any use for them. The boats were much, much smaller than these gorgeous things you see out here now. They were just little wooden fishing boats, and the men used to go out in all sorts of weather. And on this jetty here, there was a railway track that ran down through the centre, and when the men brought their boats in, they used to load their catch onto sort of a trolley thing, and then they'd push it all the way back in down to the other end there, and then it was picked up and taken to the factory.
If there were no lobsters here, I don't think there would be too many houses here at all, because there's only 7 boats counting myself, who I'm not here at the moment, but 6 boats at the moment fishing out of here. So there's not a lot of lobster fishermen going here. There's a lot of holiday houses. 90% of them come here to catch lobster for themselves in the holidays and what have you, and obviously to enjoy the beach as well. But without the lobsters, I don't think there would be a Blackfellows Caves. It would just be a little spot on the map with very little, if any, houses here. Most of our money we spend is in Mount Gambier, and we do turn over quite a bit of money in the last 10 years or so. The industry is very lucrative, and the majority of that money is getting spent in the town, whether you're buying cars or furniture or clothing or just food, or going out for a meal or to the pub. Without us spending our money there, that's a big hole in Mount Gambier's economy. And there are a lot of businesses in Mount Gambier that you talk to the people, and they do realise that. It would be nice to have a little bit more sort of respect for what the industry does in terms of, not me or anything, I'm not worried about that, but for the industry as a whole. I mean, I think we deserve a lot more respect for what we do for the community than what we get.
fishermen were almost looked down upon back in my father's days, and we became more affluent. There's no doubt, I guess I have to say those words. And Gary and I had several very good friends who are very good and top farmers, and we used to socialise quite a lot. And I remember one night sitting there having had a few wines, and something came up about, oh gee, you know, you buggers are lucky. The price of crays at that stage was probably $80 a kilo, or, you know, and we can't afford to buy them, and of course they could afford to buy them. And I said, well, the interesting thing is that once we were your poor cousins, and now we are the equivalent of you guys, or almost, you know, a little bit above it at the moment with what prices we're getting compared to your sheep and cattle. So they laughed. It went down very well because they were very good friends. But at that stage, it was very true that we rose. You know, we have a good standing in the town now.
In the winter, I needed work, and I was going to Colin Smith's for all the off season and help in there, build boats, and all them little businesses around are a critical part of the community, and you need them for fishing and for the community because it brings people and it brings money, so you need them little businesses and to thrive. Actually, this year I've been very lucky with the Victorian boys because this winter they've kept me going, and the SA boys were a bit quieter this year, but yeah, everything I use is Australian made. The necks are actually made in Adelaide. The cane is Tawaffa's in Warrnambool, and the steel comes from BlueScope in Portland, so it's Australian made, which is good quality too. The way the year's been, and Dad was going to build new cattle yards on the farm, and he's put that on hold, and I got a mate and he was going to build a brand new big shed and that, but all that's been put on hold because, like I say, that's money and that's giving someone else a job, which is then going back into the community, where at the minute it's a bit of a standstill, as in going around, coming around, all the stuff that goes with it. You go, you make money, you go out for tea with the family and you spend that money, where at the minute it's sort of stay at home and we'll just eat at home.
People often think of the lobster fishery just producing the lobster catch, but the fishery has other dimensions to it. The fishery needs equipment to perform its function. The big ticket item is generally the boat, and all of the boats in the fishery are Australian built. Engines and electronics come from overseas, but much of the boat is Australian. The aluminium plate, pipe and other extrusions are Australian from bauxite mined in Australia. The resins and reinforcing fibres used in fiberglass boats are manufactured here in Australia. Compare that with the tractors used in agriculture or the trucks and aircraft used in transport, to name just a few that are almost exclusively imported from overseas. Boat building and boat maintenance remain important businesses in some ports like Port MacDonnell, Roe, Port Adelaide and Port Lincoln.
4 or 5 inches.
I had a fellow come to me and said, oh, why don't you build aluminium? If you can build just plywood boats, you can build aluminium boats. So we had a go at that, and we built a 30-foot aluminium and then went from there. Right, we've been building ever since. You know, an aluminium. Yeah, it was different, but they all, you build them similar, only you're welding them instead of nailing them and screwing them, you know. That was the biggest difference. And the cutting was the same. You still use the same sort of saws and that to cut them. I got fellas that had tickets, you know, like welding tickets to come and weld for me, and which just one fella's still here, still with me and doing it. And then my son-in-law work with us now, and cray boats are probably 20 odd, 30, I suppose, something like that. They're all going bigger now, but you've still got to have it economically enough to run them instead of costing you a fortune to run them, get them fixed up. Instead of having it done local, there's an extra cost. It's a lot cheaper to get it done here, and we've just been lucky that we've had been able to do it here, Yeah, and even building new boats, they've either come from Western Australia or somewhere else, and that's extra cost as well. And we've been lucky enough to be able to do a few of them. We haven't done them all, but we've done a few of them, and it's good for the area. We've got boats in Darwin, Queensland, New South Wales, all over the place, in Melbourne, that area of Queenscliff, and that's sort of gone here, there, and even one we built's gone back to Western Australia where it was designed.
As the fishery's travelling along now, there's a lot less boats in the industry, so it's very important that we continue to have as many boats as we can in our fishery, because of the money that's generated through our businesses that goes back into the community. You got your deckhands, you got the local chandlery shop. Obviously, you got to get food from the Woolworths and places like that. I think the more boats, the money gets spread around a lot more, which is very good for the community.
Yeah, I think the northern zone was quite important to a lot of the small seaside towns in South Australia and the West Coast. It would bring in a little bit more money, a little bit more colour. It must have been great, especially Venus Bay. Some of the boats coming in there and tying up in the evenings. You might have 6 cray boats in there at one stage, and around the jetty, and 3 or 4 prawn boats. People everywhere, so people like people. It's quite a good thing.